All right, let's talk about ISO. It's probably one of the most misunderstood knobs in all of photography. For years, we've all been told it's one thing, but the reality, well, it's something else entirely. And I promise, understanding that difference is going to change the way you shoot.
You know the feeling, right? We've all been there. You're in a low-light situation, you're trying to get a bright enough shot, so you crank up your settings, and suddenly your beautiful photo is just covered in this distracting, speckly texture that we call noise. It's a universal frustration for photographers, but it doesn't have to be. And for decades, what's the advice we've all gotten? You've heard it, I've heard it, we've probably all said it. Oh, just turn up the ISO. The idea is that ISO is just a simple dial that magically controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. A higher ISO means a more sensitive sensor. Simple, right? Well, it turns out that's not really true, at least not for our digital cameras. The real story is actually a super fascinating journey from old-school film chemistry to modern digital electronics. And once you get it, it will fundamentally change how you approach your photography.
So let's start right there. Let's bust this great ISO myth wide open. To really understand where all the confusion comes from, we actually have to hop in a time machine and look back.
See, the term ISO originally comes from the film era. Back then, it really did describe a roll of film's actual physical chemical sensitivity to light. A roll of ISO 400 film was just chemically built to be more sensitive than an ISO 100 film. It was all about chemistry. But then, digital cameras came along, and they kept the name ISO, but they changed absolutely everything about what it actually means. Which brings us to the big reveal, the main event. In the digital world we live in now, ISO isn't about sensitivity at all. Nope, it's about amplification. This table right here says it all. With film, you picked a roll based on its chemical sensitivity. But with your digital camera, your sensor has one single fixed sensitivity. That's it. It never, ever changes. So when you turn up the ISO dial, you're not making the sensor more sensitive to the light that's coming in. You're just taking the signal it already captured and electronically boosting it, turning it up after the shot has been taken. This boosting process is called gain. And honestly, this analogy is perfect. Think of your camera as a radio. The light hitting your lens, that's the radio signal, the music. Turning up the ISO, that's just you cranking the volume knob. If you have a clean, strong signal, the music just gets louder, which is great. But if you have a weak signal that's full of static, turning up the volume doesn't just amplify the music, it amplifies all that static right along with it. So this is the really crucial point. ISO doesn't create noise. It just amplifies the noise that's already there in the signal, which begs the question, where does that initial static even come from?
Well, the main culprit has a pretty sci-fi name, photon shot noise. But don't let that fool you. It's really just a basic consequence of physics. Light is made of tiny particles called photons, and they don't arrive at your camera sensor in a nice, neat, even stream. They arrive kind of randomly, like raindrops. In low light, when there are very few photons hitting the sensor, that randomness is way more obvious, and that creates tiny variations from pixel to pixel that we see as noise.
I absolutely love this analogy from a Reddit user. Think of photons like people you're surveying. If you only ask, say, 5 people a question, your results are going to be pretty random and unreliable, or noisy. But if you ask 5,000 people, all that randomness averages out, and you get a clear, accurate result. It's the same with light. More light means more photons, which means a bigger sample size and a cleaner signal. Or, hey, here's another way to picture it. Imagine a barista making one of those cappuccinos with a little chocolate shape on top. If they just tap the cocoa powder once, yeah, you can see the shape, but it's all splotchy and uneven. It's noisy. But with a few more taps, the powder fills in, creating a solid, clean image. More light, or in this case, more cocoa powder, overcomes that inherent randomness and gives you a much better signal-to-noise ratio. But wait, it gets even more interesting. Because while this whole principle of amplification is universal, not all digital cameras handle it in the exact same way. And knowing which family your camera belongs to, that's a total game changer. So, broadly speaking, there are 3 types. First, you have ISO-invariant cameras. They have one native ISO where the sensor works best. For these cameras, shooting at that native ISO and just brightening the photo later in software gives you pretty much the same result as shooting at a high ISO in the camera. Then you have ISO-variant cameras. These have special hardware boosts at certain ISO levels that are actually cleaner than what software can do later. And finally, you have dual native ISO cameras. These are really cool. They have two totally separate electronic circuits, giving you two incredibly clean base ISOs to work with, one for bright light and one for low light. Of course, there's always a trade-off, right? Here's the catch. As you increase that ISO, you decrease your camera's dynamic range. So what does that mean? It means you lose the ability to capture all the fine details in the very brightest parts and the very darkest parts of your scene. And that's a big reason why shooting at a lower ISO when you can is so important. It preserves the maximum amount of information in your image file.
Okay, so with all of this new knowledge packed in our brains, how do we actually become smarter photographers? How do we take all this science and apply it to get cleaner, higher quality images out in the real world?
Well, the master strategy that really ties all of this together is a technique called expose to the right, or ETTR. Remember how more light equals a cleaner signal? Well, ETTR is just the practice of capturing as much light as your sensor can possibly handle without blowing out your highlights and losing all that detail. This gives your sensor the biggest, cleanest sample size of photons to start with.
So what's your new game plan? Look, priority number one is always to get more physical light. Use a slower shutter speed, open up your aperture. Do that before you even think about touching the ISO. Now, if you have an ISO invariant camera, try to stick to your native ISO to get the most dynamic range and just brighten it in post. With an ISO variant camera, it's often better to use those special in-camera boosts at those key steps. And if you've got a dual native ISO camera, don't be afraid to jump to that second, higher native setting in low light. It'll give you a much cleaner starting point.
So just remember this, ISO isn't sensitivity, it's amplification. It doesn't create the noise, it just reveals it. And the real key to a clean image isn't necessarily just a low ISO, but a strong signal from plenty of light. So now that you know the real story behind that little 3-letter setting, the question is, the next time you pick up your camera, how will you change your settings?